A boy stands in a darkening field, one hand set on his hip, the other loose at his side, dressed head to foot in a suit of blue satin that catches the light like poured water. A white plume curls up from his wide-brimmed hat. His stockings are pale, his shoes the color of wet sand, and behind him a storm is arriving, the sky gone the grey-green of a bruise, while the ground at his feet still holds an improbable gold light with nowhere left to fall. He looks perhaps 13 or 14 years old. He looks straight out of the canvas, and there is nothing uncertain in his face. This is Thomas Gainsborough's Blue Boy, painted in England around 1770. For close to 250 years, it has counted among the most reproduced portraits a British painter ever finished, printed on postcards, biscuit tins, and paperback covers until the image feels less like a painting and more like a national symbol. Stand in front of the actual canvas, though, at the Huntington in Southern California where it now hangs, and the shorthand falls apart almost immediately. The blue is colder and stranger than any reproduction has ever managed, and the boy himself, for all the aristocratic ease in his stance, was never the nobleman his pose insists he is. That gap between what this painting performs and what it actually contains is where the story starts, because the Blue Boy was built, according to an account repeated for well over a century, to break a rule the art world of the 1770s treated as close to settled law. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Thomas Gainsborough was born in 1727 in Sudbury, a wool trading town in Suffolk, the son of a cloth merchant whose business failed more than once. He showed an early talent for drawing and was sent to London in his teens, where he trained under the French engraver Hubert Gravelot and fell in with the circle of artists gathered around William Hogarth at the St. Martin's Lane Academy, then the closest thing England had to a formal art school. What he wanted to paint, by his own account in letters that survive him, was landscape. What paid the bills was faces. He set up first in Ipswich, then in 1759 moved his practice to Bath, a spa town that filled every season with wealthy visitors looking to be seen and remembered in paint. Portrait commissions from that clientele made Gainsborough's reputation and his income, even as he complained in letters to friends that he was tired of, in his own words, face painting, and would rather be left alone with a landscape and a fiddle, since he was also an accomplished amateur musician. By 1768, he was wealthy and well-known enough to be named one of the 34 founding members of the new Royal Academy of Arts in London, an institution that would go on to define and enforce what serious painting in Britain was supposed to look like. The Academy's first president was Sir Joshua Reynolds, a painter of formidable intellect and classical training who saw himself as much a theorist as a practitioner. Each year, Reynolds delivered a lecture to the Academy's students, later published as his Discourses on Art, laying out what he considered the settled principles of great painting, drawn from close study of the old masters. Among the ideas Reynolds pressed hardest was a rule about color. Warm tones, he argued, the yellows, ambers, and reds, belonged at a painting's center of attention, carrying the light and drawing the eye. Cool tones, the blues, greens, and grays, belonged at the edges, receding into shadow and distance, supporting the warm center rather than competing with it. It was not an eccentric opinion. It echoed color theory that stretched back through generations of academic painting before him. The story that has followed the Blue Boy for more than 100 years holds that Gainsborough painted it specifically to prove Reynolds wrong, building an entire portrait, its dominant figure, its focal point, its whole reason for existing, out of the one color the Academy's president had just finished declaring unfit for the job. It is a wonderful story. It gives the painting a rivalry, a point to prove, a scoreboard. It is also, on the evidence, difficult to fully sustain. To see why the story took hold so easily, it helps to remember what a portrait was actually for in Georgian London. The Royal Academy's annual exhibition at Somerset House was the closest thing the period had to a public spectacle built entirely around painting, drawing thousands of visitors each spring to walk rooms crowded floor to ceiling with portraits of dukes, actresses, admirals, and merchants' sons, all competing for the same narrow band of wall space at eye level. A portrait hung badly, too high, too dark a corner, too close to a stronger picture, could damage a painter's income for the whole season. In that setting, a portrait that could stop a room simply through the audacity of its color scheme was not a private joke between two rivals. It was a business strategy with teeth, and the fact that Gainsborough's actual target may not have existed yet does nothing to explain away how well the painting still performs that function. The specific lecture in which Reynolds lays out the warm center, cool periphery rule most explicitly is his 8th discourse, delivered to the Academy in 1778. The Blue Boy, on the evidence of costume, technique, and the likely age of its sitter, is generally dated to around 1770, a full 8 years earlier. A painting cannot be built in direct response to a lecture that has not yet been given. Reynolds had certainly discussed color and composition in earlier discourses, delivered from 1769 onward, and Gainsborough, as a fellow Academy founder, would have heard him. But the specific, quotable version of the rule that the legend says Gainsborough set out to demolish did not yet exist in the form later biographers describe. The standard account of this painting's origin, repeated in guidebooks and gallery labels for 100 years, rests on a timeline that does not quite hold together. That gap is not a small footnote. It is the first thing any honest account of this painting has to name. None of this means the two men got along. The documented friction between Gainsborough and Reynolds was real. It simply took a different shape than the legend describes. Gainsborough kept his distance from Academy social life for most of his career and rarely attended the dinners where Reynolds held court. In 1784, the tension became public when Gainsborough, unhappy with how the Academy's hanging committee had placed several of his pictures for that year's exhibition, withdrew his work entirely and began showing instead in his own house on Pall Mall, on his own terms, for the rest of his life. That is a rivalry with a paper trail, a specific year, and a specific grievance. It has nothing to do with color theory, and it happened more than a decade after The Blue Boy was already finished, which makes it a poor candidate for explaining a painting that predates it. The two disputes have simply been folded into one convenient story over the 2 centuries since, because it is more satisfying to imagine one clean act of rebellion than to track 2 separate, more ordinary disagreements that never actually touched each other. The identity of the boy has its own gap. Tradition names him Jonathan Buttall, the son of a family of prosperous London tradesmen in the hardware trade, and a friend of Gainsborough's close enough that the painter may never have been paid a formal fee for the work at all. But that identification comes from later sale catalogues and family memory, not from any inscription Gainsborough left on the canvas or any letter in which he names his sitter. It is the identification every serious scholar uses, because it is the only one with real evidence behind it, and there is no competing candidate worth taking seriously. It remains, strictly speaking, tradition rather than proof. What is not in dispute is the costume. The boy's clothing belongs to no year near 1770. It is already 150 years out of date. The slashed sleeves, broad lace collar, and soft breeches associated with the court portraits Anthony Van Dyck painted for Charles I in the 1630s. Van Dyck dress, as it was called, had become a popular affectation among English painters and their sitters by the mid-18th century, a way of borrowing the elegance and authority of an earlier, more settled aristocratic age. Reynolds himself painted sitters in the same borrowed finery on more than one occasion, so the costume alone was never a statement aimed at any single rival. Gainsborough was hardly unusual in using it. What he brought to it was a personal devotion bordering on reverence. He is reported by early biographers writing from the accounts of people who knew him to have said on his deathbed in 1788 that they were all going to heaven and that Van Dyck would be of the company. Whatever the literal truth of that final line, it captures something real about how Gainsborough approached the older master, less as a technique to imitate than as a standard to live up to. That devotion shows up in the way the painting is actually built, and it is here, in the handling of the paint itself, rather than in the disputed rivalry with Reynolds, that the real technical case for this picture's difficulty gets made. Gainsborough was known among contemporaries for an unusual studio habit. He worked with exceptionally long-handled brushes, sometimes reported at 6 feet, and painted standing well back from the canvas, closer to the distance a viewer would eventually stand at than to the close, careful approach most portrait painters of his era favored. The effect on his brushwork was immediate. It reads looser, faster, and more confident than almost anything else being produced in England at the time, built up wet into wet rather than in the slow, layered glazes Reynolds and his followers preferred. The blue itself has a history worth pausing on. For most of European painting before the 18th century, a deep, saturated blue meant ultramarine, ground from lapis lazuli imported at enormous cost from a single region of Afghanistan, expensive enough that painters reserved it for the most important passages of a commission, most famously the robes of the Virgin Mary in religious works, where the cost of the pigment doubled as a form of devotion. That changed with the accidental discovery of Prussian blue in Berlin in the early 1700s, a synthetic pigment that produced a comparably deep blue at a fraction of the price. By the time Gainsborough was working, Painters had access to a genuinely affordable, genuinely saturated blue for the first time in the history of the medium, and the Blue Boy is, among other things, a demonstration of what that new availability made possible. A dominant, room-sized figure built entirely out of blue satin would have been a very different proposition, financially as well as artistically, a generation or two earlier. To make an entire figure out of blue satin read as light, volume, and movement, rather than as a flat, cool shape sitting inertly against a warm ground, required exactly this kind of control. The fabric is not a single blue. It runs from a grey blue in shadow through a saturated ultramarine at the folds to near white where the satin catches direct light, laid down in overlapping strokes that read, even at close range, as fast decisions rather than labored corrections. Cross-section analysis of the paint layers, the kind of technical study conservators now routinely perform on major works, shows a warm brown-gray underpainting beneath the blue, a base layer that would have given Gainsborough a tonal structure to build from before the cooler glazes went on top. It is a demanding way to paint a figure this size and this central to a composition, precisely because cool tones without careful underlying structure tend to go flat and dead on canvas. Gainsborough's did not. Whatever the truth of his rivalry with Reynolds, the paint itself argues that he understood exactly what a rule against dominant cool color was protecting against, and built his way around the problem with real technical control, rather than defiance for its own sake. The painting's practical origins add another layer to this. Because Boutal was a friend rather than a paying client in any conventional sense, the Blue Boy may never have been a commission at all in the way Gainsborough's other Bath and London portraits were. Some scholars have read it instead as something closer to a private exercise, a technical challenge Gainsborough set himself using a willing and available sitter, rather than a formal portrait meant to flatter a patron's status. If that reading holds, it explains a detail that has puzzled generations of viewers. The painting has almost none of the specific, individualized attention to a sitter's actual face and bearing that Gainsborough brought to his paid commissions. The boy is handsome in a generalized way. He could be any well-made adolescent poured into borrowed finery. The real subject of the canvas, on this reading, was never really Jonathan Boutal at all. It was the color blue, and what could be done with it. The setting supports that reading too. Gainsborough's paid commissions from his Bath years tend to place their sitters in recognizable, specific surroundings, a particular garden, a particular drawing room, details chosen to flatter a client's actual life and property. The landscape behind the boy in blue is not specific to anywhere. It is an invented, general kind of English countryside, a stage set assembled from motifs Gainsborough used across dozens of pictures, rather than a place Jonathan Boutal or his family would have recognized as their own. A formal commission from a client paying for the privilege of being remembered usually included at least a gesture toward that client's real world. This picture includes none. The absence is small, and it is exactly the kind of small absence that tends to survive when a painting was made for the painter's own reasons rather than a patron's. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The picture's later life turns out to hold nearly as much hidden material as its making. For most of the 18th and 19th centuries, it stayed with the Boutal family and their descendants, changing hands within private collections out of public view, eventually passing into the collection housed at Grosvenor House, the London residence of the Dukes of Westminster. It was there, in 1921, that the art dealer Joseph Duveen negotiated its sale to the American railroad magnate and collector Henry Huntington, for a sum reported at the time as the highest price ever paid for a single painting. The sale landed like a small national crisis. British newspapers treated the departure of the Blue Boy for America as a symbol of a wider pattern in which the country's great private collections were being sold, piece by piece, to wealthy American buyers who could outbid any domestic institution. Duveen alone had already brokered a long string of similar transactions in the preceding 2 decades, moving old master paintings out of British and continental estates and into the new American fortunes built on steel, rail, and banking. Collectors like Frick, Mellon, and Morgan, who were assembling entire museum-quality collections within a single generation. The Blue Boy became the most publicly mourned entry on that list, partly because of its price, and partly because, unlike a painting locked away in a private house, it was a picture ordinary Londoners already felt some claim to. Questions about it were raised in Parliament. Before the painting was allowed to leave, the National Gallery in London arranged a month-long farewell exhibition in the winter of 1921 into 1922, and tens of thousands of people filed past it in a kind of public leave-taking for an object most of them had never thought to visit before it was about to disappear. That last detail is worth sitting with. For most of the century and a half it spent inside the Grosvenor House collection, the Blue Boy was one good picture among many in a private ducal residence, seen by invited guests and specialists, rather than by the public at large. Its fame nowhere close to what it would become. It took the threat of losing it to turn it into a national icon. The painting the crowds queued for in the winter of 1921 was, in a very real sense, a celebrity, manufactured by the announcement of its own departure. According to an account the Huntington itself has repeated in its own published material, the gallery's director at the time, Charles Holmes, pinned a small handwritten note to the back of the canvas, or its stretcher, before it was crated for the Atlantic crossing, reading simply, in French, "Goodbye," followed by his initials. The note is said to have gone unnoticed for years, discovered only later by conservators working on the painting's reverse. Whether or not the story is told with perfect accuracy in every retelling, the documented fact underneath it, that this painting's departure was treated as important enough to warrant a personal farewell note from the man in charge of the nation's collection, says something real about the size of the event at the time. The most important hidden material, though, came to light almost a century after that crossing, during a major conservation project the Huntington undertook beginning in 2018 and completing in 2022. Conservators removed centuries of accumulated varnish and small retouches added by restorers working across the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries, using infrared reflectography and X-radiography to study what lay beneath the visible surface before touching it. They also mapped the painting under ultraviolet light, which makes old varnish and later retouching fluoresce differently from Gainsborough's original paint, giving a rough chart of exactly where earlier restorers had intervened and how extensively, and used macro X-ray fluorescence scanning to read the distribution of specific pigments and metals across the canvas, without removing a single paint sample. They studied the weave and preparation of the original canvas as well, comparing it against the supplies known to have passed through Gainsborough's studio in this period, one more layer of evidence weighing against any lingering doubt about the attribution, on top of a paper trail that already stretched back through the Buttall family, Grosvenor House, and the National Gallery's own 1922 exhibition records. What the conservation team found changed how the painting is now understood. The most immediate discovery was about color. Old varnish yellows and darkens over time, a slow chemical drift that most viewers never notice because it happens gradually across a painting's whole surface, shifting everything evenly, rather than creating an obvious before and after. By the early 21st century, the varnish and old overpaint sitting on top of the Blue Boy had shifted its palette measurably warmer than Gainsborough had left it, muting the contrast between the cold blue figure and the golden ground behind him that the entire composition depends on for its force. Every viewer who filed past the painting during its 1922 farewell tour, every visitor who has stood in front of it at the Huntington for the better part of a century since, was looking at a version of the Blue Boy that had already drifted from the one Gainsborough finished. Removing the discolored varnish restored a sharper, colder blue and a more dramatic separation between figure and sky than had been visible in living memory. The imaging work turned up structural changes as well, the kind conservators call pentimenti, the Italian word for second thoughts, the adjustments a painter makes and then paints over as a composition develops. Infrared examination showed Gainsborough reworking elements of the landscape and the placement of the boy's feet as he built the picture. Evidence of a composition arrived at through revision rather than settled from the first sketch, consistent with the loose, exploratory studio practice described by people who watched him work. None of this amounts to a hidden second painting lying underneath the visible one, nothing on the scale of a fully different portrait discovered beneath the surface. But it confirms that the picture's famous confidence and ease, on the canvas the way it looks today, is the result of visible labor and revision, not a single unbroken stroke of inspiration. What the technical study did not resolve is worth stating as plainly as what it did. No imaging session, however sophisticated, can recover a conversation that was never written down, which means the exact reason Gainsborough chose blue, whether it was a considered technical challenge, a private joke with a friend's son standing in for a canvas, or simply the color of satin he happened to have on hand that year, remains outside what any scan can tell us. Conservators can show what the paint is doing. They cannot show what was in the painter's head while he did it. The honest version of this story keeps that distinction in view, rather than smoothing it over with a tidier ending, because the gap between documented technique and undocumented intention is exactly the kind of gap the Reynolds legend rushed to fill with a story that turned out not to fit the calendar. Put all of this together, and the verdict this painting actually supports looks different from the one printed on museum gift shop postcards. The story of Gainsborough single-handedly defeating Reynolds with one act of chromatic defiance does not survive contact with the calendar. Reynolds had not yet delivered the specific lecture the legend says Gainsborough was answering. The rivalry between the two men, real as their mutual professional wariness certainly was, cannot be the literal occasion for this specific painting, in the way the story wants it to be. What survives the scrutiny, and what the technical study of the paint itself actually demonstrates, is something quieter, and in some ways more impressive than the legend. Gainsborough built an entire dominant portrait figure out of a color range that conventional theory, whether or not Reynolds had yet put it into a numbered lecture, treated as recessive and unsuitable for a composition's central focus. He did it using an underpainting structure that gave the cool glazes something warm to sit on top of, and a loose, distance-painted brushwork that kept the fabric looking like light moving across silk, rather than flat pigment sitting still. That is a real technical accomplishment, verifiable in cross-section and visible to the naked eye once the old varnish is gone, and it does not need an invented argument with Reynolds to be worth admiring. There is a difference between a painting that proves a point and a painting that solves a problem, and the evidence gathered across Project Blue Boy points toward the second description rather than the first. Gainsborough was not staging a public argument he could not yet have known he would need to have. He was working out, through underpainting, glazing, and the fast, distance-judged brushwork his contemporaries commented on, how to make a color the received wisdom treated as background material carry the entire emotional weight of a portrait. That is a narrower, quieter kind of genius than the legend offers, and it happens to be the kind that leaves physical evidence behind for a conservation lab to find, rather than the kind that only survives as an anecdote in someone else's biography. The painting's other performance, less discussed than the color theory story, but harder to look away from once it is named, is social rather than technical. A merchant's son, dressed in the borrowed costume of a vanished aristocratic century, stands in a landscape that belongs to neither his own time nor Van Dyck's, performing an ease and entitlement his actual position in 18th century England did not entirely support. The painting has been read for 250 years as a study in aristocratic grace. It might be more accurately read as a study in the performance of aristocratic grace by someone who had to borrow the costume to attempt it, painted by an artist who had spent his own career torn between the landscape work he loved and the face painting that paid for his house in Bath. And underneath both of those performances sits a third one, the quietest of the three. Gainsborough did not add it, and neither did Butthall. Time did. For most of the picture's public life, the version people were actually looking at, whether in the National Gallery's farewell exhibition or in the Huntington's main gallery for the better part of a century, had already drifted from Gainsborough's own finished surface, dimmed and warmed by varnish he never applied and never intended. The blue boy the world fell for across generations was, in a real material sense, not quite the painting Gainsborough made. Only since 2022 has it been possible to stand in front of something close to the original relationship between that cold, confident blue and the storm-colored sky behind it. The painting hangs today in the Huntington's main gallery in San Marino, California, in very nearly the position Henry Huntington placed it when his collection first opened to the public in the 1920s, positioned to face across the room toward Thomas Lawrence's portrait Pinky, a pairing the museum arranged decades after both artists were dead, and that has nothing to do with either painter's original intention. It has become, in the century since, its own small tradition, two unrelated portraits from two different painters and two different decades, facing each other across a California gallery because an early 20th century collector liked the visual rhyme between a boy in blue and a girl in white. The blue boy has spent its whole American life, in other words, inside yet another layer of staging it never asked for, added by people who came long after Gainsborough had already put down his 6-foot brush. When the painting went back on view in the fall of 2022, after 4 years away from public display, the Huntington built an entire exhibition around the conservation project itself, letting visitors see the infrared scans, the cross-sections, and the cleaning tests side by side with the finished canvas, an unusual choice for an institution whose signature work had spent a century being displayed as a settled, finished object, rather than an ongoing case file. Attendance for that reopening outpaced almost every other show the museum had staged in years, evidence that the appetite for seeing behind a famous picture's surface, rather than simply at it, has not diminished since the crowds lined up outside the National Gallery a century earlier for a very different kind of last look. It is a strange kind of loyalty a painting can earn, wanted first for the illusion it presents, and later, just as strongly, for the documented process of taking that illusion apart in public. None of that staging is what makes people stop in front of the canvas today. What makes them stop, whether or not they know a single fact about Reynolds, or Boutal, or the recent conservation work, is the same thing that made Georgian London stop in front of it, and made 1922 London queue around the block for a final look before it crossed the Atlantic. It is the color and the confidence, and the specific way Gainsborough made an entire boy's worth of blue satin catchlight that should, by every rule the era's own theorists had written down, have refused to catch it at all. The legend about Reynolds will probably never fully die, because it is a better story than the truth, and better stories tend to outlast careful chronology. But the truth underneath it, the 8 years of chronological trouble, the borrowed Van Dyck costume on a hardware merchant's son, the note pinned to the back of the canvas by a departing director saying a private goodbye, the 2 centuries of yellowed varnish that rewrote the painting's color before anyone noticed, and the 4 years of technical work that finally gave it back, is a better story anyway, because every part of it is something that can actually be shown. Stand in front of it now, at the Huntington, in the color Gainsborough actually mixed, rather than the color 2 centuries of varnish gradually turned it into, and the boy is still looking straight out at you, still entirely sure of himself. The storm at his back has not moved in 250 years, and it is still not clear whether it is arriving or already passing. What has changed is how much more there now is to see behind him, and how much of that seeing had to wait for a lecture that never actually happened, a note nobody found for decades, and a coat of old varnish finally, carefully, taken away. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.